Yeah, thanks. Yeah, give me this other one, please.
On my microphone.
Yep, it sounded better. So I'm a little bit nervous. So you're going to have to be patient with me. And I know patience don't come easy to me, whatever. Yeah, I'm Paul, I'm an addict. And it says, while our efforts to make amends, this is good, 1 second, typical. While our efforts to make amends may make a difference in the lives of those we have harmed, this process has its greatest impact on our own lives. Our objective is to begin clearing away the damage we've done so that we can continue with our spiritual awakening. By the time we work our way through the process of making amends, we will surely be astounded by the level of freedom we feel. We are involved in a process designed to free us from our past so that we are able to live in the present. I thought that was good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm poor an addict. And I close my eyes when I share as well, so, But I have had a really good look around the room. And when I look at you think there's got to be a God, there's got to be a higher power, there's got to be something working behind the scenes. Because there's people in here from my day one, there's people in here that I grew up with, there's people that I've met on my recovery journey around the world. That can only tell me that something special is happening in Narcotics Anonymous. My process is not a straightforward process. It's not I came in here and I was fixed and everything else. I come from the Jerry Springer generation. That's the generation I came from. We used to have a meeting called the Jerry Springer meeting in Camden Town, for obvious reasons, And I know Jimmy spoke about, the history, of, where he comes from, and I've been involved in the history of where I come from. And that's been really important to me as well. I've been able to uncover some stuff, that possibly in the future might have some meaning for some members. 2 weeks in, I remember I was in an institution. I think I first heard about Narcotics Anonymous in 1993. I'm going to get into the amends, but this is all part of the big picture. I started bumping into people. I remember I see a guy walking up Camden Town and I thought he looked different and he was going to the gym because I'd remembered him at 13 years of age with needles coming out of every bone in his body. And all of a sudden he put weight on, he looked different. I always remember him walking up Camden Town, going to the gym. And and then I started bumping into people that were clean, whatever that meant. That didn't mean anything to me. People from, were going into institutions and then turning up at my house, and I was working with people in recovery, and I didn't go to meetings because I was using. And I think I went to my first meeting. My first meeting was there's actually someone that was probably in my first Narcotics Anonymous hospitals and institution, and he lays claim to the fact that it was him and the guys that came in and did H&I in this institution is the reason why I'm still clean. And I didn't last too long. I remember I got to my first meeting. I want to go a little bit. I know people have spoken about their families and stuff like that. In the 9th step it speaks, some of us dedicate our lives to helping addicts. That's me. I dedicate my life to helping addicts. And I had family. I have family as well. My family, pretty much, like quite a lot of people, I got expelled from probably 5 or 6 schools. My first visions when I woke up was my mum was a heavy spirit drinker. My mum and dad were, beating the shit out of each other and stuff like that. So that was the first, and we were on the end of the beatings as well. Now I knew when I got expelled from school and stuff, like we were put into care homes A to B and everything else. I knew when I'd done something wrong that when that key went in the door, I knew that there was a foot and a right hook coming. You know what I mean? You know, whatever, you know. I don't think we understand, you know, the level of damage within, you know, like in some of our families. You know, I've only been able to discover who I am because I've come to Narcotics Anonymous. My family don't come from any form of spirituality or anything like that. They come from life on life's terms and fumble your way through it whatever way you can. You know, my nan's answer to a spiritual condition was to go and get a job. You know, and I wasn't too keen on that. You know what I mean? You know, I wasn't too keen on working or anything like that. You know, so I had resentments with my mum. My mum used to get sectioned as well. My mum's, she used to get sectioned in this place called Free and Barnet, which was a mental health institution in North London. It's this big house on the hill, you know, whatever. I mean, I actually had a job up there, and I knew instantly it was Free and Barnet. It was quite famous, sort of mental health institution, nut house, whatever you want to call it. You know, and there was a lot of stigma attached to that. You know, that like, especially, you know, you've got family, you know, taking sides, and, you know, you've got loads of different voices having different opinions and whatever. There's not a lot of compassion, you know, whatever. People do not have the tools, they just see the harm. You know, I was in a meeting here the other night, and I'll tell you what, there's a good reason why they tell us to switch our phones off. Right, because I was literally in the meeting, and I looked down at my phone, and a member had posted that, like, a guy, they used to say, always keep a newcomer in your back pocket, right? And I met this guy 3 years ago. He's been clean 3 years. Now, another member writ that, like, all I see, right, was that he'd hung himself or whatever. Now, you know, that's all I see. And I was in the meeting, and it felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. You know, whatever, you know, it felt like, you know, and I was in a meeting and I was a little bit angry or whatever about it. And I didn't see. And then a little bit later on, and obviously I'd got, by the time I'd come out of that meeting and made a couple of phone calls, we found out he was all right. Now, I didn't know if it was the jet lag or something like that. But I didn't sleep a wink that night. You know, whatever, you know, and we you know, when he rang me, he said, Paul, it's so-and-so, and I'm ringing from heaven, you know. He said, I'll tell you what, I'm disappointed because only you and my sponsor have called me to check that I'm still alive. You know. But, you know, so... But yeah, anyway, thankfully he was alive or whatever, you know. And look, I didn't go and tell the other member what I felt or thought, you know what I mean? And to be honest with you, they're still up there. And I haven't, like, you know, whatever, just, you know, said anything or anything like that, you know what I mean? You know, because I know that she's obviously not well as well. You know, I know what it's like to be in recovery for many, many years, have a mental illness, and not know you have one. You know what I mean? Not know you have one. You know, not know that I have a disease called addiction. You know, I only really found that out of 13 years clean. You know, and this is why for me it's like a worldwide fellowship as well. When it talks about our steps in the literature, it speaks about that this process is meant to be done over and over again. You know, where I come from, you know, it was pretty much like, you know, and no disrespect to, you know, because my sponsor's a lovely man and he walked me through some really tough times, especially in early recovery. He walked me through some severe obsessions and infatuations and stuff like that, you know, where I was being overwhelmed with stuff, you know what I mean? You know, whatever, you know, I'd got attracted to a member. We only had coffee or whatever and I was gone. You know, for about a year and a half, you know what I mean? You know, I thought I could change her mind and stuff like that, you know, and it was really difficult, you know what I mean? You know, because, you know, we go to meetings and there's lots of good sharing. You know, a lot of us are sharing really well and everything else, and there's me, like, you know, like the one with all the stigma, you know, whatever, but determined to stay clean. regardless of the shame and everything, and I know it was nothing to do with that person whatsoever. You know, I was engaging in a process of working the steps, and it was my first go round the steps. You know what I mean? A written fourth step will unlock parts of our subconscious that remain hidden when we theorise or we verbalise or we talk about. You know, because my default setting is to lie, is to not have honest conversations, you know, whatever, and remain in a state of like surface healing. I can't have conversations unless I do the work, because I have an inability to trust other human beings. You know, because where I come from, you know, it's like anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence. You know, and so, you know, there's no wonder. You know what I mean? But you know, there's some. I had kind of two sponsors, and. My first sponsor, when I did that very first step 8, he told me to put... Patrick actually asked me, you know what I mean, you know, whatever. And he actually told me to put my name on the top of the list. And which I couldn't understand for love nor money, and it didn't make sense. It wasn't practical to me whatsoever. I couldn't possibly understand why he would even recommend something or suggest anything like that, you know. And I mean, that step 8 kind of like laid it out for me as well, you know. And so, you know, I mean, when I started to get clean, the last few years towards my using, and it was pretty obvious to me that even though I was like in the midst of active addiction, that, you know, I still had a conscience. I was starting to level up, that, you know, I was starting to come to the conclusion that possibly my mum wasn't, as, you know, the bad person in everything and stuff like that, even though I was still, you know, smoking crack and heroin and drinking and whatever else I could throw down my neck, beg, borrow and steal, you know. And, you know, so, I mean... I thought someone touched me now. You know, you poked me in the ribs. I don't know if that was my mum. You know what I mean? You know, I didn't know if it was the 5 minutes or something like that. You know. And you know, I've got my eyes closed, so you are going to have to like prod me. You know what I mean? But you know, so you know, but by the time I'd gotten clean, you know, I was trying to track down my mum and wasn't having much success. And it's very strange I managed to track down my mum, because I was in a boarding school, and I think I got expelled from nearly I think 4 or 5 schools I got expelled from. And I was bumping into a guy that I was in boarding school with, and he had an eye for the ladies and stuff like that, and he was walking around, he was up in Kentish Town and started talking to this girl and, you know, chatting her up and everything else, and it just happened to be my mum's daughter from another guy. And that was how I got back in contact with my mum, and he, you know, so it turned out she mentioned me, and my pal then he's like, oh right, I didn't realise, you know what I mean, you know, and that was how I kind of got back in contact with my mum. But my mum never really left like a mile radius, you know. She always sort of stayed in the area. And then I was able to kind of make amends with my mum and stuff like that, and you know, it was always difficult because you never had that relationship, you know what I mean, you know, or whatever, you know. So she'd chew me ear off and stuff like that, you know, and you know, so you know, so we had a relationship over the years and whatever. And my mum passed away in March last year. And she had, I mean, you know, this is typical of my mum, you know, whatever, you know, they diagnosed that she had dementia, and as far as I was aware, that she displayed all the signs of what I knew dementia to be. And so, like 4 or 5 months, she was slowly losing her mind. Now, I couldn't, fathom, even though, because my mum had been in mental health units and stuff like that, and she was, even when I went and had the conversation with her and stuff like that, she was ready to forgive. She wasn't, regardless of everything else that comes with, the loss and everything else, she was, she was, a typical mother, unconditional. Or whatever, and, so, I was in regular contact with her. If not, I would be bumping into her around the shops and stuff like that and whatever. But her mental health began to deteriorate. And I thought it was weird because I thought it was signs of like mental illness and stuff like that. And it seemed very similar to some of the mental health things that I was experiencing, or hallucinations and hearing like noises from neighbours and stuff like that and banging. And every time someone came round the house, the banging would stop. You know what I mean? And like the funny thing was like towards the end, probably 3 or 4 months from when she died, I remember, she literally like begged me to come and stay round her house. You know what I mean? Because what was happening, she was hearing voices. You know what I mean? She was hearing voices. Someone coming round at 8 in the morning, putting, keys in the lock and stuff like that. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to come round. All I have to do is be there. That's all I have to do, regardless of what, I'll come round, I'll stay the night or whatever. Now, in the 9th step, it speaks about that in time many miracles will occur. And I was actually, so I went over, and whatever, which was difficult because if anyone that's dealt with someone with dementia, you need a lot of patience. You know what I mean? Especially if you're being accused and stuff like that, and you know what I mean? Whatever, So I was aware of some of them things anyway. And, but it hit me. Like that night that I was in there kind of like looking after her and whatever, it hit me that it was the first time in 45 years that I'd actually spent the night under the same roof as my mum. And I had to do that a couple of times as well. And she had quite, they put her on the end of life ward, so I didn't know, and I really didn't want to spend a lot of time there, watching my mum die in the last, I remember getting to the door and just thinking, I see my brother there and my half sister there, and my half sister did the majority of the legwork. You know what I mean? I'm not even going to sit here and lie to you. You know what I mean? I spent as much time because I just didn't want, because I know, I'm around here long enough to know about grief. You know what I mean? Whatever. I didn't really want to. I watched both parents die in recovery. I watched my dad die from cancer. I never knew what cancer was. I remember he met me outside. We used to meet, go and have a coffee and stuff like that. We met at Warren Street. I thought he was losing a little bit of weight, but didn't read too much into it because he was 63. And I remember he told me, Paul, I've got stage 4 cancer, which didn't mean anything to me. But what it actually means is the professional opinion, the doctor's opinion, the educated opinion was basically that, he had X amount of time to live. The only way he was going to get out of this, and if there was a miracle from God, you know what I mean, or if there was some kind of divine intervention, you know what I mean, whatever. But even like for months, I still never accepted that this was the truth, you know what I mean, because I'd never had any experience, of watching, someone die of cancer. And he would get better and he would put weight on and, whatever. But anyone that's ever watched someone die from cancer, you see them whittle away very quickly when they begin to go. And my dad died from over a 14-month period. When he began to die, he began to whittle away to nothing. You know what I mean? Whatever. And I remember the day he died, and I just had a gut feeling. I could have easily been wrong or something like that. And I remember I went to a meeting, and I remember when I was at the coffee pot in the meeting, and his wife called me to say that Paul, he's gone. But I was in the place where I needed to be. I needed to be where there was a meeting, you know, or whatever, because ultimately it's been this place, you know, we can lose sight, you know what I mean, you know. There'd been a couple of conversations. You know what? It's been lovely to even just sit with the people that I came in recovery with, have something to eat. We was at the Russian market, just be ourselves, have a laugh, have a giggle. You know what I mean? You know, not be too serious and stuff like that. And it was just nice to kind of do that stuff. You know, I've been able to in recovery as well to sort of like. You know, when my brother and his ex were using and hard at it, and their daughter became a ward of court and stuff like that, and there was custody battles and things like that, I was able to stand up in social services. I was able to be their voice because Narcotics Anonymous had given me a voice. You know, to try and give them a set, because I knew if they got their hands on his daughter, she would probably end up at the other end of the country. You know, so I was able to do all that stuff. You know what I mean? You know, whatever. I remember one night I was, and I always used to share. I wonder when my brother's going to get. They were always talking about getting clean and stuff like that. You know what I mean? I was never talking about getting clean or anything like that. I didn't. You know, what would it be like if I got clean? You know what I mean? You know, what's this clean malarkey? You know what I mean? You know, no, I never talked about it. But I was the first one that got clean, and. You know, so I've lost my chain of thought on that point. I gets a call one night. This is it. I gets a call, and the call is that my brother has taken an overdose and he's in St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. And my first, you know, I do what we did. I got up, I got dressed, I got on the bus, I got to St Mary. I knew where St Mary's in Paddington was because I used to go to the meeting, the Wednesday night newcomers in Paddington, you know, in the mental health wing, the Patterson wing. I used to go to that meeting, and you know, so I remember. So I didn't know what you know. I think I got the kind of consensus that, you know, it was me that was going to have to do it because my sister put the job on me by the way it looked. You know, and I remember going up there, so I could have been really identifying a dead body. I didn't know if he'd had a hit, I didn't know if something had gone on, you know what I mean, you know, whatever. He took a load of paracetamol, washed it down with alcohol, and I don't think, you know, I think it was possibly a cry for help, but, you know, misadventure happens. And we was able to get there, and I hadn't seen him for years. And I remember I tapped him on the back, and he said, "Who's that?" I said, "It's Paul." He said, "What you doing here?" I said, "I'm your brother." You know, and because of members in NA, the ball got rolling quite quickly, and he managed to get into a detox and stuff like that. And it was members of this fellowship that kind of, you know, helped put things into action and move things quickly, and probably a little bit quicker than what some people would. I mean, I know it took me 3 months initially to get into an institution and you know, and get out of the area that I was from, you know, whatever, and get 3 meals a day, etc. and stuff like that. And then I went away to the West Country, you know, whatever. But I was determined to stay clean. You know, from 2 weeks clean, I was determined. You know, that there was nothing. But obviously for me, you know, the recovery process is a little bit more complicated than that. But I think the most important thing was I got myself in the chair, I sat down in the chair, and I didn't move from that chair. You know what I mean? You know. And I'm one of these, you know, I mean, you know, we all got our different views and stuff like that, you know, I mean, you know, this is my home. You know, I live here. You know what I mean? You know, some people will look at that and think that's pretty fucking sad. You know what I mean? You know, whatever. What the hell are you? What do you mean you live in Narcotics Anonymous? I live in Narcotics Anonymous. I love it. Some days I don't. Some days I want to kill you. You know, I don't. We're not going. We have to go back about 10 years for all that. You know what I mean? You know, whatever. You know, it probably took 13 years for me to begin to calm down. You know, and stuff like that. You know. I think the step work, doing it again at 13 years, and then making it part of my recovery. You know. Have you? Okay. And making that a part of my recovery. I think for me that's really important. Not religiously, but to make sure that like I go through the steps and stuff like that, so I can be intimate, I can have conversations, I can be vulnerable. I don't have to bring my step 5 into the meeting. That's between me, God, and my sponsor. But what's important is that I engage in the process of the 12 steps. I think it's really important that we learn to be compassionate and, you know, have patience with each other. I know my process is an arduous process, it's a tough process. You know what I mean? I think, you know, we're amazing human beings, you know what I mean? And this is not for the faint-hearted. I think we're a really group of courageous people when I can get out of my own little world, when I can see the beauty of Narcotics Anonymous and the life that I've got. Because before I got here, you know, it weren't there. You know, it was I lived in my room, and I waited for a knock on the door for someone to bring me some drugs. You know what I mean? That was my life. Clock watching the clock. You know, Sundays, whatever day it was, there was times when I just could not move. I didn't have the energy to go out and score. It was literally bedridden. You know, sometimes it's difficult. We get our lives, we get great lives, we get all that stuff. You know what I mean? You know, I've had some amazing experiences in this place. I was speaking to another member. I was speaking to Ava, and she said, "You know what? I just need to be amongst my people." You know, because you know I can start to get. You know what I mean? You know, my job is like feast or famine. And, you know, so, you know, you can come in and you can get, you know, a lump of work and you're feasting, and then sometimes you're in survival mode, you know, whatever. But I've always been looked after. You know, I've had some amazing, you know, I did go on to get educated in recovery. I began, you know, after I'd had a spiritual awakening in that first step after 13 years, you know, I knew there was a higher power, you know, whatever the evidence for me, and you can't explain it to somebody that hasn't experienced it. They think we're the Moonies, you know, so it's difficult to explain. When you're called, you're called. You've got no choice in the matter, yeah. And, you know, so it's... I ended up getting educated. I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in ministerial studies and prophetic concentration. I remember I went to the conference. I didn't even think I'd got the degree. I just thought I'm going to the conference. You know, and people were being ordained as ministers and stuff like that. I mean, I wasn't ordained. But I tell you what she did do. She gave me my bachelor's degree. I was the last person to get the bachelor's degree. And I'm still with that ministry. You know, so all those schools that I got expelled from and stuff like that, you know what I mean? You know, that was the first time in a long time that I'd cried in recovery. You know what I mean? You know, there's stuff I ain't even got time to talk about, but it's been the fellowship that's been consistent. It's loved me when I've been off, when I've been the one that's like, you know, in early recovery, and I've, you know, every other word was a swear word, and people began to leave the meeting, and I would think like a good use up will kill you. You can't even take a good share off of me. You know, like, what, you mean you're leaving the room? What's that all about? You know, and there's people in here that, like, you know, whatever, that I've, you know, when I've had a fight in the tear up in the meeting, there's people that had walked me down after I've had a fight outside a meeting, people that have put their arm around me and stuff like that, just to show me how much they love. There's people that I've travelled to their country, they picked me up at the airport, they've took me to places. You know, when I get out of my own head, when I get out of my own self and I see how powerful this fellowship... Listen, whether or not, you know, whether you've come for an holiday, right, you've invested in coming to a convention. And in our country, in the United Kingdom at the London Convention, we call it a spiritual celebration of recovery. That's what they put when they redone the guidelines. They put that the London Convention is a spiritual celebration of recovery. And I'll just read something from step 9, and you can go and listen to Nick and Bobby. And I'm going home to bed because Right. Changing the way we live is a lifetime process. The most important results of the 9th step will be found within ourselves. This step teaches us a great deal about humility, love, selflessness and forgiveness. We begin to heal from our addiction and no longer live with any regrets. We grow spiritually and find that we are gaining a new level of freedom in our lives. We are free to dream and to pursue the fulfillment of our dreams. Our lives stretch out before us like a timeless horizon. Our higher power has given us an invitation to live, and we accept it with gratitude. Thanks for letting me share.